to the fall 2012 Oswald Backus Memorial Lecture. My name is Maria Milicheva, and I'm an acting director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the sponsor of tonight's event. Tonight's lecture has been made possible by a Title VI Department of Education National Resource Center grant and the Oswald Backus Memorial Fund. This fund, as well as the lecture series, were established in honor of the first director and founder of CRIS in 1960, Oswald Backus III. Oswald Backus finished his PhD in Russian and East European history at Yale University and came to KU in 1950. Very soon, he was the one who secured funding to support the growth of area studies in the Soviet and East European region at the University of Kansas. And the Backus Fund is made available through a generous gift from an anonymous donor and supported by Professor Emerita in History, Anna Chichava. Unfortunately, Anna could not greet you all in person tonight. She sent regrets to the Backus family and to the audience and to the visitor, who's going to be introduced shortly by Professor of History, Nathan Wood. So she sent her regrets. Anna is the one who usually has a lot of kind words to share with the audience about the Backus family. I wonder if there are any family members in the audience? Yes. Thank you so much for continued support of CRIS and the Backus series and support of the events. I know you guys come quite often to our events. Well, with no longer ado, I would like to pass the mic to Nathan Woods, who I would introduce tonight's speaker. Please, Nathan.
Thank you, Maria. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Brian Porter-Szucs, who is, oh, I'm sorry. All right. So, shall I repeat that? Brian Porter-Szucs, who is professor of history at the University of Michigan. He's the president of the Polish Studies Association, and the person whose name I see most in my inbox, because he is as also the sort of in charge of the HNet Polish listserv, so H Poland, and so I see messages from Brian all the time in my inbox. As president of the Polish Studies Association, Brian has done tremendous work in establishing the HNet listserv, promoting our web presence, and in promoting the Polish Studies Association as an international grouping. So if formerly the Polish Studies Association was mainly a North American institution, now Brian is overseeing an expansion that includes members of the board who are in Europe, some in Poland, some in other European countries. So it's exciting to have someone of Brian's sort of caliber and vision leading the association. Brian is very well known in the field for his important books. His first book, When Nationalism Began to Hate, Imagining Modern Politics in 19th Century Poland, came out more than a decade ago and is a major contribution in the field. Brian is well known for his very sophisticated and capable intellectual history, an intellectual history that's very much connected to culture and not isolated or removed only in the sphere of say, the written word. Brian co-edited this book, Christianity and Modernity in Eastern Europe, with Bruce Berglund, whom some of you may know from his time here at KU. This is a wonderful collection, and I particularly like Brian's introduction. Again, shows his great sophistication for themes that can be divisive or just easily misunderstood. He has a fine eye for unpacking ideology, and that's most evident in this in his recent book, Faith in Fatherland, which is about Catholicism, modernity in Poland. The book has just won the Kolchitsky Prize, the 2012 Kolchitsky Prize, which will be awarded just this week at the AAASS conference that some of you will be attending with me in New Orleans. So it is a great honor to have Brian here with us, and I look forward to his talk tonight, Faith and Fear in 20th Century Polish Catholicism. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, and for the plug for the Polish Studies Association. I always make sure to put this up here because I know that some of you in this room are members, but if you're at this talk, you all probably should be. So send me an email and I'll sign you up. Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski once observed that nowhere else, quoting, nowhere else is the union of church and nation as strong as in Poland. That doesn't sound like a very controversial claim. We can back it up in a bunch of ways. 98% of all the children in Poland are baptized. This includes a significant number of atheist parents. But 98% of all the kids in Poland are baptized. 92.8% of all marriages in Poland are conducted in a Roman Catholic church. When you ask in surveys, what is your religious denomination? 93% will say Catholic. This will vary a little bit depending on how exactly you pose the question, but it's always around 90%. The rituals of the church punctuate daily life. The calendar is demarcated by religious holidays. The seasons see their passing through religious commemoration. The clergy have long enjoyed a very large degree of respect and authority. If you look at Polish art, Polish music, Polish writing, literature, you will see Catholic iconography, Catholic metaphors, Catholic phrasing, Catholic ideas penetrating all of this. But despite all of that, many members of the church in Poland today are very worried. They're very worried that the Catholicity, if that's a word, of Poland is threatened. And if we go a little deeper into those statistics I showed you a moment ago, we can see why they might have some concern. Religious practice is something that's really, really hard to quantify. It's one thing to ask people, what is your faith? It's another thing to ask them, how often do you go to church? It's yet another thing to figure out how often they really go to church. In Western Europe, we find that the number of people who actually go to church is somewhat higher than the people who will admit it. In the United States and in Poland, it's quite the opposite. Where is it expected you're going to go to church? So you're going to say that you do. Fortunately, Catholics, at least, have a way around this problem. They have this concept of the Dominicantes, the number of people who go on a Sunday to church. And they measure this. They've been doing this for a very long time. Every Sunday, in a Sunday in November, that's not a holy day, not a special day, they literally stand outside the church doors and count everybody who goes in. And then they compare that to the parish rolls. So that allows us to do something pretty unique, I think, in the Polish case. We can actually measure real church attendance. And the numbers don't look good. I'm sorry, the print is rather small, but over here we have 1980, the peak of Polish Catholicism, the Solidarity era. Downhill ever since. To the point where we are now seeing slightly fewer than 40% of the population going to church on Sunday. Now that would be a big figure if we were comparing it to the rest of the European Union. It's a little lower than the United States, but again, it's really hard to measure it in the US. Hard to say. Probably about similar to the American figure. But it's declining, and it's declining dramatically. When people are asked whether they adhere to the teachings of the church, we also see some cracks in this picture of universal Catholicism. So you ask people, giving them some options on what is your attitude towards the teachings of the church. I'm a believer and I adhere to the teachings of the church, 46%. Now remember, 93 of them said they were Catholic, but only 46 say that they actually follow the teachings of the church. 47% say, I'm a believer but in my own way. That's not a very Catholic answer. Basically, in Poland, we see a lot of what in the United States we call cafeteria Catholics, who sort of pick and choose which parts of Catholicism they'll decide to follow. One of the, for the last 20 years or so, one of the touchstone issues in measuring Catholic adherence to Catholic doctrine is the question of abortion. Now, on this question, overwhelming majorities of Poles disagree with the Church's position, do not follow the Church's position on the teaching of abortion. There are large numbers willing to accept abortion in cases when the mother's health is in danger, if the pregnancy is the result of rape, or if the child might be born handicapped. All of those are against Catholic teachings, but most Poles, overwhelming majorities of Poles, accept them. Only 15% of the population would accept the Church's teaching of no abortions under any circumstances. Polish attitudes towards sexuality hardly fit the picture of a devout Catholic. And any of you who are considering a trip to Poland, you might enjoy the next numbers. In a survey from 2007, 63% agreed that it is entirely normal that people in love have sexual relations. Marriage is not necessary for this. Again, not a very Catholic teaching. 33% of Poles were willing to even accept, quote, sex does not require either love or marriage, even a passing union can provide pleasant, beautiful experiences. The hookup culture is not unique to campuses on the United States. It's also in Poland. On matters of doctrine, ignorance is a huge factor. Catechism is in the schools, in the public schools in Poland. And it is not required, but it might as well. It's very hard not to take. And it's included in your grade point average. So it's a big deal. So almost every kid in Poland gets a religious education. Well, I'm sorry, it ain't working very well. 23% of people who have self-identified as devout practicing Catholics were unable to name a single author of a gospel. 43% of those defining themselves as devout believed that it was possible to receive absolution for original sin, which you don't have to go too far into your catechism classes to learn it doesn't quite work that way. Now, it's hardly surprising that figures like these have generated some concern among the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church in Poland. And many worry that the oft-cited figure of 90% Catholic or 98% Catholic is in fact an illusion. In the words of Father Mieczysław Nowak, no statistic can render precisely the question of faith. For a large percentage of Poles, faith is only a stereotypical mindset, a tradition, an extremely superficial declaration. There is even a new word that has entered Polish. No surprise there, Poles borrow words even faster than English speakers do. One of the new words is Irlandizacja, the Irelandization of Poland. That's what's coming. Ireland, of course, even a decade ago, 90+% Catholic. Last year, the Seminary of Dublin had one graduate. One. Something like, I forget the figure now, 23%, I think it was, of the priests working in Ireland today are Polish. A quarter of all the priests in Europe are Polish. And Ireland is the big scare story for Catholics. You know, within a course of 10, 15 years, it went from being ultra-Catholic to like completely non-Catholic. Church attendance in Ireland is gone. So there is much fear of Irlandizacja in Poland. In a sense, fears of Poland's potential secularization are tied up with other concerns about joining the EU, the consequences of EU membership, and all the changes that have occurred in Poland since the fall of communism. But there's something deeper going on here too, something that actually goes much further back than just the recent concerns about Irlandizacja, about the European Union, about 21st century secularization. Because in fact, Catholics in Poland have been complaining about the superficiality of Polish Catholicism for a very, very long time. And they've always been saying that secularization is just around the corner, and we better worry about it. 1901, Archbishop Józef Bilczewski, Saint Bilczewski now, said in a sermon that, quote, "It is not enough to call oneself Catholic. One must not simply call ourselves Catholics, but be Catholics. We must be Catholics at home and outside of home, every day and every hour, with, so to speak, every inch of our being." And he went on to say that this was not happening. People were just treating their Catholicism superficially, more as a marker of their national identity than as an actual faith. And that sort of Catholicism, that sort of folk Catholicism or ethno-Catholicism or national Catholicism, was, Bilczewski said, one step away from atheism. This would be a constant theme in homiletics and sermons throughout the 20th century. One of the focal points of my own research has been the shifting tendencies in sermons. Something that historians have not often looked at, surprisingly enough, but it's a very rich resource. It tells us a lot. We can't tell what Catholics in 1920 believed, because we can't ask them. But we can determine what they heard. What they heard when they went to the church every Sunday. And that tells us something. Given that a large number were illiterate, sermons tell us a lot. And once we get to the second half of the 20th century, we have a very rich database of sermons, thanks to the communists. Because the security services routinely put bugs in the churches, listening devices. And now you can go to the Institute for National Memory or to the Archiv Matnovic and actually get those transcripts. So you can read all these sermons. For a historian, it's wonderful. I love secret police. They're great for historians. The more spying, the better. Anyway, if we look at these Catholic homiletics over the course of the 20th century, we see this theme again and again. Secularization is coming because Catholicism has become too national and not enough based on faith. But an equally enduring theme, also ever present in the 20th century, is that Poland is a Catholic nation. At its very essence, it is and must be a Catholic nation. So my goal today in this talk is to explain how you fit this together. How do you fit together these complaints about the over-nationalization of Catholicism, moving away from the Catholic faith towards the idea of Catholic identity? How that's a problem, that's bad. With simultaneously the building up of this ideology of the Pole as the Catholic, or the Catholic as the Pole. They kind of go together. To do this, we need to explore this complex intellectual bundle called the Polak Katolik. That's an expression in Polish. Pole Catholic, putting these two nouns together. The Pole Catholic. It's a hyphenated concept that brings nation and faith together into an inseparable whole. The Polak Catholic ideal has been used to evoke an understanding of history that gives meaning to Poland's past by making the nation dependent upon the church. The church as the true and enduring bearer of national identity through time. And by making the church dependent upon the nation, with Poland as the anti-morales Christianitatis, as the bastion of Christendom. The roots of this idea, in some ways, can be traced as far back as the Counter-Reformation. So you can, if you really want to do a deep history of this, go back to this sort of joining of the Polak Katolik, back to the Counter-Reformation. But it ebbed and flowed and was really not a big theme in cultural life until the modern era. The modern form of this Polak Catholic ideal really took shape about a century ago. As Catholics in Poland struggled to come to terms with new forms of religious and political diversity that they hadn't had to contend with before, and new ideological challenges from both the left and the right that they had to make sense of. Ironically, claims about Poland's fundamental Catholicism not only emerged in the face of religious and ideological diversity, they were in fact a response to that diversity. So in other words, the concept of the Pole Catholic emerged as a reaction to the recognition that that wasn't what reality was. Because of the power of this Polak Catholic equation nowadays, it's easy to forget that it wasn't always taken for granted. No, not at all. If we jump back to the 19th century, we find a great many priests and Catholic publicists who expressed serious reservations about the Polish national cause and the Polish national movement. To be more precise, in the 19th century, the standard line was that it was fine to have affection for one's homeland. That was good. That was good. But never make it political. Never make it political. The attitude of the Vatican was quite consistent in this regard throughout the entirety of the 19th century, and it was that you owed obedience to your rightful masters. This created some troublesome and unfortunate developments in the United States, where the Catholic Church did not actually have as pure a record on slavery as it perhaps should have. And it created problems in Europe, where the church's line was, obey your masters, obey your rulers, whoever they might be, because God put them there, even if we might not like them. So, 1830. 1830 is a big uprising in Poland, an armed uprising against Russian rule in 1830. And the Vatican comes out with a very strong statement in opposition to the Polish cause. This was Pope Gregory XVI, wrote a famous, infamous encyclical called Cum Primum. As the pontiff put it, we are taught most clearly that the obedience which men are obliged to render to the authorities established by God is an absolute precept which no one can violate. The Tsar of Russia, he went on in this encyclical, was a legitimate prince, and the Poles owed him their submission. And in rising up against him to fight for their independence, they were committing a very deep sin. The sin of pride, of hubris, for imagining that they could take into their own hands history. God had placed them under the rule of the Russian Empire, and that was God's will. There were priests who defied that, priests on the ground in Poland, who defied that and helped the national cause, but quite uniformly, they were disciplined by the church hierarchy even before the Russians could get it. In 1863, there was another big uprising in Poland. Once again, the clergy was generally a little more supportive than the last time around, but not much. The rebel government asked the clergy to declare their loyalty, either to the Tsar, if you're not loyal to the Tsar, if you're not loyal to the Tsar, declare your loyalty as a Pole to us. 20%, only 20% did so. Church authorities were unanimous in urging the rebels to lay down their arms and accept legitimate authority. Now, after the 1863 uprising, as we move into the late part of the 19th century, the church's loyalism was reinforced by a reluctance to provoke increasingly repressive occupation policies by the Russians, and also, moving further west, in the German partition, particularly in the German partition. The Russification and Germanization processes of the late 19th century, last third of the 19th century, did push some priests into the arms of the nationalists. But more, the majority, it reacted by withdrawing to a very narrowly delineated understanding of their pastoral duties emphasizing their pastoral duties, saying we'll stay out of politics. And the typical response of priests in the Polish lands was, I want to use the language that will be most effective in carrying out my pastoral work. If I've got a Polish parish, I want to preach in Polish. Well, much in Latin, but when I'm not using Latin, I want to use Polish. But if I've got a German-speaking parish, as many in, say, Silesia did, I want to speak German. Many, in fact, on the western boundary, were bilingual. And they just wanted to be able to use whatever language worked best for each audience, because their concern was saving souls, not promoting the national cause. Now there was an issue that could push the church into opposition. And that is when one of the governments, either the Russian or the German government, the Austrians were very nice to the Catholics, surprisingly, but by the 19th century. But whether the Russians or the Germans would try to interfere in church affairs, then there would be trouble. So if there was an attempt in the 1870s and 80s, the so-called Kulturkampf, where in the German lands there was an attempt to create state certification for priests. Priests had to go to a state-funded seminary and pass an exam written by the state. That the church would not accept. There they drew the line. That provoked opposition. But as long as you didn't touch the church's own privileges and inhibit their ability to carry out the pastoral duty, they really preferred to stay out of it. On a deeper level, 19th century Catholic writers writing in Polish, worried about patriotism a little bit. They worried that if it was not carefully controlled, it could provoke conflict and violence. And violence could lead to sin. For example, Father Marian Morawski, very prominent Jesuit from the late 19th century, he predicted in 1884 that all of these national movements that were rising up in the region were dangerous. And they were going to push our region, quote, into a wild state in which nations will either fight each other or hold each other in mutual respect by shaking their clubs. That nationalism will lead to tribalism. And we don't want that. Such concerns might have seemed a little overblown at the time, but they would soon become all too salient in Poland with the rise of a political movement known as the National Democratic Movement, or by its nickname in Polish, the Endecja. This group emerged in the 1890s, initially, and emerged as the leading political manifestation of the Polish national movement at that time. And for the first several decades of its history, people are often surprised to learn this, but for the first several decades of its history, it was very anti-Catholic, very hostile to the church. Now, this changed later, but it was very anti-Catholic. The founders of the Endecja believed in social Darwinism, what we call social Darwinism. That's not fair to poor Charles Darwin. Better called Spencerism, after the guy who actually coined the idea of the struggle for survival. Darwin never said that. Survival of the fittest is different from the struggle for survival. Herbert Spencer and his idea of struggle for survival, that really captivated these early National Democrats and nationalists all over Europe. The Index were by no means unique. So they preached an idea that the nation was engaged in a struggle for survival with other nations, just as creatures were engaged in struggles for survival in their evolutionary battle. That's a very un-Darwinian picture, too. Roman Dmowski was the founder of this movement, once called upon Poles to, quote, embrace an elemental egoism that would preclude moral qualms, because moral qualms will get in the way of doing what you need to do to make the nation survive. Christian ethics, he said, might retain some value as a standard for regulating interpersonal reactions. He himself was an atheist. He was not a Catholic. Then he said, yeah, sure, for regulating interpersonal relationships, okay, and a Christian might be okay, but not on the international sphere. Quote, The relations of the individual to the nation and the nation to other nations lie properly outside the sphere of Christian ethics. Aside from Christian ethics, there are national ethics. And national ethics consisted of the idea that that which served the nation is good, that which weakened the nation is bad. Period. Another early member of the National Democrats, a guy named Zygmunt Balitsky, developed this into a whole new ethical system that he called national egoism. And he wanted it to replace what he saw as the weakness of Christianity. National egoism. He said when one goes against the interests of one's own nation, one becomes immoral. There was one particular moment when there was a drought in a part of Russia. And there was a fundraising campaign going on in the Polish lands to raise money to help the people, the peasants who were actually starving as a result of this drought. And Balitsky came out and said, this is a crime against the nations because we want as many Russians to die as possible. And it's only that weak Christian ethics that leads you astray. Not surprisingly, this stuff wasn't well received in the church. A certain Father Chmielewski, writing in Warsaw's Przegląd Katolicki, which was the leading magazine of the Warsaw Archdiocese, in 1904, saw the rise of groups like the Endecja as, quote, a signum temporis that demonstrated the decline of the true faith. The whole point of Christianity, he argued, was to bring people together regardless of language, customs, and location, and, quote, to create from them one Christian society united by the bonds of love for God and for one's neighbor. Chmielewski predicted that nationalism could only lead to atheism. And, quote, for what is national chauvinism but a product of a pathological lack of love for God? As late as 1923, Archbishop St. Józef Pilchewski, who I quoted earlier, issued a pastoral letter instructing the faithful that national sentiment was only allowable if it was, quote, grounded in a supernatural religious duty to love one's neighbor. He criticized all of those, quote, super patriots who turned the Lord God into some kind of national deity, to whom they can appeal during warfare in various ways, in poetry and prose. Oh God, destroy our enemies. Just as it is not appropriate to deify the nation, in the same way it is not permitted to nationalize God. But here comes the punchline. Despite all of this, within 3 years of that statement, there would be a pretty much explicit alliance between the Roman Catholic Church and the National Democratic Party in Polish politics. It was actually already building at that time. That's why he wrote that. And with the convergence of the tradition of national democracy, the Endecja, and the tradition of Roman Catholicism, out of that came this idea of the Polaka tonic. That paradox can be explained in part by the Endecya's own ideological, or at least rhetorical, evolution, because they change. There's a lot of change going on here. By the time we move into the 1920s and there's an independent Poland and there are elections and the Endecya has to actually run for office, that kind of anti-Catholic stuff wasn't working so well. And there was a evolution in their rhetoric that eventually, I think it's fair to say, became a substantive change as well. They stopped talking about national egoism. We don't talk about that anymore. Moreover, in 1927, the Pope denounced a French politician named Charles Maurras. Charles Maurras was the leader of a group called Action Française, which was a prominent right-wing nationalist organization in France. Maurras, like Dmowski, was personally an atheist who was coming around to the idea that you had to use the church. That the church was just too big a national institution, and if you wanted to have any political success, you better find a way to use it. And the problem with Maurras was he was very explicit about it. He said, I don't actually believe in Catholicism. Their teachings are wrong, but they are French. the church is French. So if I'm a good French nationalist, I have to respect the church. It's a weird kind of argument. And Pius XI thought it was a weird argument too, and so he put Maurras's books on the Index of Forbidden Books, and condemned him, and Charles Maurras's political organization completely fell apart, and now people, except historians, forget who the guy is, which is entirely appropriate. Well, Domovsky could read those tea leaves, because they're like exactly the same. So Domovsky very quickly, within weeks, after the denunciation of l'Action Française, Domovsky writes a book called Kościół, Naród i Państwo, the Church, the Nation, and the State, in which he said, among many interesting things, this idea of national egoism is not something we ever believed in. No, in fact, it's a Protestant idea. Only a Protestant could believe something like that. Could never be our idea. No. We like Catholics. The Catholic Church is absolutely fundamental to the very essence of what it means to be Polish. If you go to Warsaw today, and you walk in to the St. Jan's Cathedral, the main cathedral in Warsaw, and you turn to your right, you'll see a big plaque to Roman Dmowski with a quote from this book, in which he says, Polishness and Catholicism are inextricable. He didn't start going to church, by the way. This was political. Supposedly he had a deathbed conversion when he finally died, but there's no third-party witness to actually prove that, and so we don't know. But the evolution of the Endetsia is not the whole story, because also there was an evolution in the church as well. There were changes there too. The boundaries of Catholicism shifted a bit, so that our Venn diagram of nationalism and Catholicism developed an overlap. In fact, a pretty big one. And at the core of that overlap was a new approach to conflict and war. One that continued to reject the liberal scientism of Herbert Spencer and the so-called social Darwinism, all that struggle for survival stuff. That's bad. We don't want to do that. We don't want to believe in that. But nonetheless found ways of talking about an existential conflict that was going on, that was in fact a struggle for survival, that mattered a lot, and a struggle in which the nation and the church must cooperate. Polish sermons and other texts from the 19th century always taught that God was the only meaningful historical agent. I mentioned this before. Individuals could earn God's wrath or earn God's mercy. But individuals, people, did not make history. God made history. And God punished or rewarded as appropriate. Anyone who actively pursued war, according to these 19th century texts, as a means of attaining territory, wealth, or national glory, were supposed to be condemned, and often were. Condemned for the sin of pride, believing they could take God's will into their own hands. On a deeper level, establishing God as the only historical agent made it hard to position conflict as the engine of history. It's hard for us to remember today, but in the 19th century, liberals believed that conflict was the engine of history. That was a liberal idea in the 19th century. Because back then, liberalism was economic liberalism as well as political liberalism. So the idea of the free market and the free politics. And in this idea of the struggle in the free market would push history forward. So liberals believed that conflict drove history. And if liberals believed it, Catholics certainly didn't. So that's a constant theme in these older texts from the 19th century, that conflict is not an engine of history. If there's war, it might be the scourge of God. It might be God punishing us for something. But it's not going to lead us anywhere, except maybe to repentance. Now, the restoration of independence in 1918 did not put much of a dent in this mood of recrimination, Because the new Poland that emerged in 1918, after 123 years of there being no Poland on the map, the new Poland that emerged was not one the church was very happy with, to say the least. The church hierarchy was very unhappy with the way things turned out. First of all, this new Poland was a secular democracy. There was a clause in the Constitution that said, a very strange formulation, we recognize that Catholicism is the religion of the overwhelming majority of the Polish population. But they would not say that it's the state religion. In fact, they explicitly established a separation of church and state. And in 1918, the Catholic Church didn't like that idea of the separation of church and state. In fact, they had a word for that idea. I don't know if any of you know the history of Catholicism, but there's a word for that. It came out of the papacy of Leo XIII. The word is Americanism. There's an encyclical from Leo XIII called Against Americanism, and it's about separation of church and state. Worse still, from the church's perspective, after a few years of independence, there was a coup, a military coup in Poland. A guy named Józef Pilsudski took power. Pilsudski, it's true, he was baptized as a boy. But then he became a socialist for most of his young life. Then he converted to Protestantism because he wanted to marry a Protestant girl. And he really didn't care about religion one way or the other. Whatever he was, and people still debate this, the one option I think we can rule out is Catholic. He is buried today in Wadek, as some of you might know, next to the Polish kings and other Poles. And the bishop at the time, Bishop Sapieha, was infuriated that the government had the gall to force the entombment of Józef Pilsudski, an atheist, or worse, a Protestant, but certainly not a Catholic, under the Catholic cathedral. So after a few weeks, the cardinal, Sapieha, he was already the cardinal, yes, he was already by then a cardinal, said that we're getting too much traffic in this crypt, and it's disrupting Mass. So I got to move the crypt. And if you go today, you don't notice it. You go down in the crypt, you follow the crypt around, you don't notice what's going on. But when you are at Pilsudski's tomb, you're about this far from the church wall. You're not under the church anymore. And then came the Great Depression. I mean, things are bad. This is not a good time. God is not looking at this favorably. The consensus among Catholic priests and publicists to all these events, summed up by a guy named Irenaeus Kmiecik, Father Irenaeus Kmiecik, very charismatic, very famous preacher. He would go around and do recollections at various parishes, very famous and much demand preacher. He said this in a sermon from 1930. Was not that terrible World War I, a clear divine punishment for the crimes and sins of the world? Who cannot see that? And to this day, the effects of that war persist because people still persist in their sins instead of recognizing their sins and with penitence, praying to God for mercy and forgiveness. Jeremiahs like this were very common. But arising out alongside this is a new trend in Polish homiletics and Polish Catholic thought. A new way of interpreting all of these disappointments and all of these hard times. Already in 1919, Bishop Wilczewski, who I like to quote, was kind of hesitantly suggesting that God might not have been working alone in bringing Poland back to the map of Europe. In a pastoral letter that he titled Post-War Duties, he recognized, quote, that only someone spiritually and morally blind would fail to see the Lord's hand in the restoration of Poland. But then he carefully added, we do not, after all, violate the principle of Christian humility if we remember that our resurrection is also, in a large part, the result of our own merits. This claim of responsibility could also apply when things went badly. But in those cases, and here comes the important, the key intellectual move here. Things could go badly and we could be to blame. Why? Because the agents of evil are out there and we didn't resist them adequately. In 1929, a contributor to Życie Pracy, which was the diocesan newsletter for the Łomża diocese, directly repudiated the teaching that Poles brought about their own suffering. This was a long-standing teaching in the church, and he just went right up and said, that's wrong. Quote, when it is said to us that we deserved our fate, talking about the partitions, we answered, it isn't true. Poland had an unbroken feeling that a crime was committed against it. The concept of divine providence remained intact within this worldview, but the context for God's intervention was changed, was fundamentally realigned. As Życie Pracy later, that means life and labor, later explained, God's anger was provoked by the forces of evil that had penetrated into Poland. And faithful Catholics suffered insofar as they failed to do enough to stop it. Responding to some floods in 1934, there were some nasty floods in 1934. And the paper described those floods as divine punishment. Okay, so far so good, that's old news. They do that all the time. But here's what they're being punished for. Listen to this. Same newspaper. Do not imagine, you madmen, Varia, that God would allow himself to be ridiculed and derided. Every blasphemous word, all of your shameful verses that you spread all around Poland, so too all around Poland they cry out for divine punishment. And this divine punishment will reach not only the blasphemers themselves, but also those who do not struggle against blasphemy and the blasphemers, but instead peacefully and apathetically look on as blasphemous books and newspapers spread across the countryside. So you're not doing enough to shut up the blasphemers. That is why God is punishing you. Not because you've done anything wrong, you nice, good Catholic. It's a big change. Looking at 19th century sermons, you get the impression that every Catholic is just a miserable bundle of sin. The sermons are incredibly gloomy. Always that you are going to hell almost certainly. There was one sermon I remember in particular where the priest was saying, he posed the question, is it better to die or live? And then he went on how horrible life is. Life is horrible. Totally horrible, all the way. And it would be better, you might think, to die. Well, the problem is, almost all of you are going to hell. So you probably don't want to die. So this mood in the 19th century is gloomy and dark. But by the 20s and 30s, it's really changed. No, you Catholics, you're good. And you're suffering because of those evil other people. Those blasphemers. This partial dislocation of sin to groups or individuals outside the church would have been unusual before, but it was very common by the 20s. And it was a move of fundamental importance. It became very common. The eventual result was a proliferation of conspiracy theories that explained and linked together everything that was going wrong. Secularism, capitalism, socialism, decadent popular culture, ethno-religious diversity, and whatever. With each passing year, these fears fed upon themselves in a cycle of escalating anxiety. As you read the press or listen to the sermons, read the sermons, you can see this escalating worry, this anxiety. Things are bad. In 1913, going back towards the beginning of this, Archbishop Alexander Krakowski in Warsaw wrote, quote, nowadays there are more false prophets, bad teachers, and illegitimate authorities than ever before. Because of this, I am afraid. By 1927, Father Felix Brojanowski was echoing a popular theme when he told his parishioners that the enemies of God ensnare into their traps the working people, young people, and women in the factories. They call meetings, I love this, meetingi. That's a good Polish word, meetingi. They call meetings and lead religious discussions. They also write plays and hide behind the scenes, having fun and laughing loudly. But in reality, it is not they who stand behind the scenes. Someone else occupies that place, rubs his hands together, and cackles. Satan. Brzezinski's reference to Satan is very characteristic of Catholic conspiracy theories. And it's something that made Catholic conspiracy theories a little different from secular conspiracy theories, and there were a lot of both in the 20s and 30s. In 1927, Father Alphonse Grashinsky told his parishioners that, quote, Satan is struggling with us for our souls. But Grashinsky went on to explain that this danger wasn't just a question of personal salvation. Here's another shift. We start to move away from the question of personal salvation towards the question of national salvation. Since World War I, Grashinsky believed, the church was faced with another struggle, 100 times more dangerous, against enemies that were trying to destroy Christianity altogether. There are enemies everywhere, he said. Enemies within us, enemies around us. Satan has uncountable and extremely dangerous helpers. We, on the other hand, are recognizing with fear that the battlefield is increasingly emptying, and our helpers are increasingly retreating. Now, there's a rich scholarly literature in social psychology, and in anthropology, sociology, about conspiracy theories. Where they come from, why they take hold, why they sometimes, in certain contexts, seem to blossom and other times not so much. A general consensus in the scholarly literature is that in the modern world, we are ruled by global forces, a global economy, political forces that we can't perceive, can't really see. You can't see the market. You can't see capitalism, right? These are things which are beyond our perception. So to make sense of what seems on an experiential level like senseless suffering, this argument goes, people embrace stories about malfeasance. I can't quite understand why I lost my job. So someone must have done it to me. And I'm going to get him. This approach helps us understand why 20th century Catholics might look for hidden enemies. Declining rates of church attendance, rise of hostile political parties, the secularization of political culture. All this was happening in the 20s and 30s, and it cried out for some sort of explanation. But that sense of disorientation alone it doesn't quite, I think, explain the conspiracy thinking of the 1920s and 30s. After all, the concept of divine providence was already there. And divine providence gives you a reason, a way, to understand the unexplainable. God willed it so. So why do they move away from divine providence? Why do they no longer want to talk about divine providence as much, and instead to talk about enemies? Why? What's going on? Well, I would argue that the main reason is that there's another shift going on in Catholic rhetoric at this time. As the church moved away from the docility and sort of remove of the 19th century towards a more activist stance. There was a shift, beginning with the papacy of Leo XIII and moving on. A shift away from a disengagement with the world towards an engagement with the world. A desire to fix the problems of the world, to engage them. Now, this concept of action, directly tackling the problems of the world instead of leaving all the initiative in God's hands, had been percolating through the church for a long time. It was institutionalized with this very famous encyclical. It's probably the single most famous encyclical of the last 200 years, Rerum Novarum, of May 15, 1891. And in Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII called for the faithful to abandon their passivity in the face of social injustice. If you see social injustice, you should actually try to fix it. Catholic social activism is usually located in a narrative that begins with Rerum Novarum and takes us through all the heroes of liberal Catholics, right? So the Second Vatican Council, liberation theology, the Maryknoll Order, Dorothy Day, and other progressive Catholics, this idea of social engagement. So sort of the left of the Catholic Church loves to talk about this. And that's all accurate. All of this did emerge, this social engagement to fight poverty. Definitely emerged out of Rerum Novarum. But it doesn't tell the whole story, because there's a slightly darker flip side that I think nobody's quite noticed. Focusing on social injustice, a move away from the transcendent towards the corporeal, towards the concrete, the embodied, the earthly, the mundane. And that's fine, as long as the sources of suffering in those realms are identified as social problems that we must solve together. But that same ideological move made it possible to talk about enemies, actions, action in the world, took on a whole new meaning once exploitation and persecution were incarnated in a flesh and blood community, rather than disembodied ideas or generic sinful behaviors. Now, Leo XIII's most prominent advocate in Poland was Józef Pilczewski, and that's why I've been quoting him so much here. One person once said that reading Pilczewski is like reading Leo in Polish. And these guys were very close. And he was made a saint in 2005, precisely because of his work to alleviate the poverty of his home region in Galicia. Like Leo, Pilczewski described quiescence, passivity, as a form of sin, the sin of omission. He called to action. But his call to action were not directed at abstract social problems. He also thought that there were individuals and groups out there that were causing harm, and they needed to be combated. Speaking in 1911, he lamented that the church's enemies were, quote, developing their strategies with increasing vigor, and he called on his audience to resist these things. My dear ones, your most sacred duty is to clean out from your homes, from your villages, the emissaries of the Masons, the Socialists, the Mariovites, the Lutherans, the Orthodox. If you fail to do so, you would commit a crime that would not be worthy of absolution. Whoa, those are big guns. Polish homilies in the coming decades would continue to chastise the faithful for the same vices they always worry about, mostly sex. But alongside such diatribes, we find an increasing tendency, like I say, to look for these communities. Archbishop Józef Teodorovich, I think he's a saint too. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he is. Put it this way in 1931. There is no other choice for the world. Either perish in the grip of the Soviet demons, or rise up and be reborn in the lifeblood of Christian culture. Christ and the Antichrist stand today before the world, and it must choose between these two. This almost Manichaean choice appeared again and again in every genre of Catholic writing, from serious theological tomes to popular magazines. Even the devotional magazine, Rycerz Niepokalany, which is mainly just with prayers and songs and things like that, even they had this message. They proclaimed, quote, today we must clearly and decisively declare where we stand, under the banner of Christ, in his ranks, in the ranks of the servants of his Immaculate Mother, or do we go under the banner of Satan, the banner of rebellion and revolution, of hatred to God and to everything related to him? There can be no talk of reconciliation or compromise here. With this reasoning as a foundation, nearly every controversy in the 1920s and 30s could be subsumed within this presumed war between the church and its enemies, between God and Satan. Father Antoni Szymański, a very important figure, the founder of Catholic Action in Poland, one of the rector of the Catholic University of Lublin, defended his own activism in terms of this ethical battle. The contemporary struggle between the kingdom of Satan and the kingdom of the Lord Christ, he wrote in 1927, plays out less in the study, in the area of religious studies, dogma, or Christian piety, and increasingly in the area of collective and public life, in the family, in the schools, in the university, in associations, institutions, in the state, in offices, workplaces, factories, and banks. He called them the faithful to become warriors in the cause of God. Now, as in this text, it was common to locate the advance of Satan's minions within the cultural realm, not in the metaphorical sense, as in when we use the word cultural wars, but very literally, in the idea that Satan is going to first attack the culture, thereby undermining our morality and thus making us weak, and therefore subject to further incursions. Cardinal August Chlond, he was the primate during the interwar years, the number one figure in the Polish church, offered a very elaborate and highly gendered and anti-Semitic account of the enemy's plan of attack. Here's how it was working. The struggle with religious studies in the schools, the careful support given to all sorts of sectarianism, that's Protestants, the moral depravity spread by fashion, the press, pornography, theater, dance, the cult of nudity, I have no idea what that is. Do we not have all too much of these things wherever the Semitic spirit manages to take control? And finally, the degradation of the women, so that instead of being a pillar of ethical culture, she becomes an agent of decadence, of marital disintegration, of the gradual expulsion of the church from all aspects of life. Have we not had fresh examples of this every day? Step by step, the attack proceeds, and it has more and more influential allies. All this helps us understand how Catholic rhetoric dovetailed eventually with nationalist rhetoric. When the battle of Satan was located in the realm of cultural life, religious rhetoric converged with secular conspiracy theories that had been building for some time, mostly anti-Semitic theories about the Jews controlling the world and leading to Poland's downfall. Since the enemies in these two stories were identified as essentially the same, the Judeo-Masonic, socialist, capitalist, banker, world conspiracy, they got the same enemies on both sides, you have the grounds for a common front. The episcopate described this linkage in 1920, in the midst of the Polish Bolshevik War, in a joint pastoral letter promising, quote, that the Catholic Church will become the national shield and fortress against the inundation of anarchy and evil. Future tense is interesting there, which implies that this is a change. The bishops imagined themselves standing alongside the Polish army in the battle to protect the nation. And, quote, just as our brave, heroic soldiers defend Poland against the external enemy, we must defend it against the internal enemy. This image of a united struggle of God and fatherland was on display in a key moment, 1936, by its organizers described as the largest pilgrimage of the interwar years to Częstochowa. Press accounts at the time differ. There was either 100,000 people there or 20,000 people there. A lot of people came. Anyway, the organizers prepared what they called a proclamation to the Polish nation, in which they described this pilgrimage not as a spiritual, not only as a spiritual quest, but as preparation for battle. Here's what they said. Today, at this time of moral collapse for individuals, families, nations, today, when Satan is striving to rule over the earth through the godless, the freethinkers, communism, Bolshevism, neo-paganism, when organized Masonic action is striking out at our fatherland with ever greater force, the young people